morning. Thank you. I still forget to wait. Please turn with me to Ecclesiastes, the first chapter, as we look at the subject this morning, hope. And as I think I gave Blake a slightly hopeless version of the scripture reading this morning, hopefully we won't end up in a hopeless place. Understanding that that's kind of where Solomon starts, if you believe that Solomon is in fact the king, the son of David, who is writing Ecclesiastes. He's kind of at an interesting point in his life that reminded me of a visit I got to make over to the hospital a couple of weeks ago for a talk by one of the psychologists, I think on staff there, to some of the preachers in the area. And I was a little bit vague about what it was about when I was first going there, but I told the elders it was about suicide intervention. And some of the things I learned is that in this area, even though we don't have necessarily the highest number of suicides, it has among the highest rates of suicide here in the state. And one of the questions he posed was why. And they didn't come to any definitive answers, which in a lot of ways is super appropriate for a book like Ecclesiastes, because Solomon starts off blunt, honest. And that's one of the things that that young man or that older gentleman actually impressed upon me in dealing with that kind of situation. One, don't get in over your head. We're just preachers. We're not the experts. But we have a role in helping people to get to a place, God willing, where they can find someone who can help restore their hope beyond that moment. But they said in the moment, that is the role that we can fill, beyond clergy, but as people. Helping people find a moment of hope in a situation where the enemy or life has simply gotten them to fixate on that which is going wrong. And in that context, I read Ecclesiastes this time, understanding that Solomon doesn't start with any jokes. He doesn't start playing. He doesn't start pretending like he sees hope. He starts straight out wondering where it is. In verse 1, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. What does a man gain by the toil at which he toils under the sun? A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. As that first chapter is possibly broken up into a couple of sections where he goes on like that for a while. He's going to talk about endless cycles, things that seem like they go on, but they don't seem to have a whole lot of point to them. Because at their best, sometimes they just start all over again. And they don't necessarily seem like they're going anywhere. And if they are going anywhere, it's not anywhere beneficial. And I loved his honesty. Because as we said from time to time, it's not always with regard to sin that sometimes when people ask how we're doing, we just put up a good face and we keep it moving forward. Sometimes, as he said, one of the reasons why he said he thinks that the rates are higher here is sometimes one of the things that reminds me of back home is sometimes we are conditioned to just bite down and power through a situation in which we need help. And so one of the things that Solomon does here is he doesn't simply bite down and power through denial. He starts out with honesty, because as we said in the young adults class, he might not have to be talking this out with anybody. He might just be in a situation where it's just him, pen, and paper, and his problems. And he can be as honest as he wants to be. He may not think he's writing some treatise, as much as he's just pouring his heart out, understanding that he needs help. Why? Because it's going to get better in chapter 1? No, it's going to get worse before it gets better. Verse 12 is where that shift seems to happen between the first and second sections of this chapter. I, the preacher, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem, and I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. Ever got into a situation, or like our brother said, or similar to what our brother said in the communion talk, where we lose track of the things that we actually have to appreciate, why we come together on the first day of the week. See, it's one thing if I lose track of why I come together on the first day of the week, but it's another thing when I get to the point in my life where I think that the very person or being that I look to for refuge is actually the source of my trouble. And this is the king who prayed out, as we've said in chapters before. When he was a boy, he understood the need for God. And there are times in life where no matter how well you understand it early on, life will drag you through some things where you need someone to remind you that God is not your enemy. And ultimately, that's the great thing about seeing Solomon, that if it's him, that candid because he's supposed to have it together. He's been doing this since he was that young. So why is he wandering now? See, like we said, life doesn't always leave you in a safe place, because, like you said, one of the versions of when the enemy left Jesus after tempting him at the end of his trials in the wilderness, one of the versions says he simply left him forever. No. He left him until an opportune time. And so there are times when Paul is exactly right. Resist the devil and he'll flee from you. But oh, that he'd stay gone forever. Oh, if I can just get that in the deal. If I can just endure this one. He's just, no. And so that is what Solomon seems to be going through. Why? Because Ecclesiastes, you think there's a reason why they put it at the end of the Proverbs? We said it seems super similar to, if you've ever read C.S. Lewis or listened to C.S. Lewis. I don't do a whole lot of extra reading anymore. But famous author of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, a series of children's books, who also wrote books geared towards adults. Mentioned it before, Mere Christianity. His attempt to get through all the things that divide us as Christians, from his perspective in England, the Church of England, and the Catholic Church. What is it that gives us common ground as Christians is what he wrote as Mere Christianity. But after getting all of his acclaim for finally finding his faith again, after we said he lost it on the battlefield, not believing that a good God could allow the kinds of misery that he saw in World War I to happen, he got it back, and he was the one who wrote those books. But see, later in life, he got married after a long wait. It's a story that hit close to home. And after he got married, it didn't last long, because eventually she passed on after a brief battle with illness. And so now he seems like he was back to square one, because all the faith that he had regained, he's not sure if he still has it. He's not sure where it's at. And that ended up becoming a book, I think it was called The Grief Observed. Please double check me on that. And so now he seems like he's back to square one. And that's why Ecclesiastes seems so appropriate. Because after Solomon spent all his time raising Israel to the height of where it should have rightfully been, and then in addition to that, writing out his wisdom for how the next generation can take it and move it forward, now he's starting to wonder whether or not the wisdom mattered at all. Why? Verse 18, really verse 16. I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceive that this also is but a striving after the wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation. And he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. Now he's starting to wonder not whether his life mattered, all during the good times too. If you ever been in a period of your life where it's Murphy's Law, anything that could go wrong will, where are you when you not only think God, if he's there, it doesn't seem to be helping right now, but all the things he's done for you, all the accomplishments that you're applauded for, they seem like they're nothing. And now you've got misery on top of misery on top of. And so now you maybe, at least from my perspective, I'm starting to understand where Solomon was writing from this time. It's after a life well lived that he's now having to deal with those questions. And once again, he's not the only one. Clive Staples Lewis, after writing all those books, he had one more to write, and it was about suffering. And understand, the good thing about the wise is much like C.S. Lewis and all of his wisdom. As a soldier, he was a man who was perfectly competent to be at the brightest and the best universities of England. Why? Because once he got done soldiering, that's exactly where he ended up. As a professor at, I think it was Oxford or Cambridge. I can't remember which one. But it's part of the reason why he ended up finding his faith again, because he got in a collective of folks who, once again, like Solomon, they were super honest. Some believed, some didn't. And in putting their minds together, he began to find his reason to believe once again. And so through all of that, that is the candor with which he spoke with his friends around those tables and talked about the reasons why he didn't believe. It's quite possibly why he was able to write about belief at a much deeper level than many can if they start out pretending, oh no, I'm good. I believe in God. He's got me. Because there's a time for that, but as you know, one of the famous proverbs or portions of Ecclesiastes goes in chapter 3, there's a season for everything. There's a season to love and there's a season to hate. He's going to go on. There's a season for me to be strong in my faith and make it clear that everybody knows that. There's a season for me to be real honest, because God is helping me to understand that my faith may not be where it needs to be. As some of young people have talked about or asked questions about, okay, in evangelism, some of the times I've tried to offer up, we can only give them what we've got. And sometimes when they're asking us questions that we can't answer, like I say, sometimes I lean too heavily in I don't know, but I lean heavily into I don't know because I've learned from the school of hard knocks how badly it can be when I'm offering up an answer that they can see through as not being completely true. It tends to do more harm than good. And so in his candor here, Solomon has actually opened himself up to get deeper answers that go beyond all the wisdom that God had given before him, because he's opening himself up to be honest about all the ways in which all that previous information just ain't fixing this problem. And so in his candor, he has now prepared himself to start on a journey that I think the great minds give me reason to look up to. It's because they stay open. No matter how much they know, it's not enough. They know that there's a God in heaven that was the source. When Joseph was asked or tasked with the great mystery of not only telling the king what his dream was, okay, smart guy, tell me what I dreamed. The first thing he does is he prays to God. And then once he gets the answer, he doesn't pretend that that's not where he went. Because he already had a reputation, he could have just stepped up with the answer and been like, I'm hitting about 500. Everybody knows I got this one. No. He said the answers come from God. And that is one of the situations in which it goes back to, like we said, my dead horse verse. If any of you lacks wisdom, ask God, who gives generously. And that seems to be, in its simplicity, one of the keys that opens up the highest levels of wisdom. It's acknowledging that no matter how many answers God has given me in the past, that's not good enough for this Sunday. That's not good enough for this question or this new interaction that I'm having with somebody who needs to know something about God. And so I need to constantly be in touch with him, asking him for things that not only can help me, God willing, but keep me alive so I can fulfill my purpose to help others, which is where Solomon is going to seem to piece together his wisdom. Why? Because if you know how the story ends, it's pretty simple, isn't it? Turn to verse 12, chapter 12 with me. Not all that complicated. Verse 13 of chapter 12. The end of the matter. All has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. Does that even sound like an answer? I think we had that back in Genesis, right? And maybe just about every other book of the Bible is devoted to that same thing. But as we said, some of the short lessons that might come out this week, I don't know much about math. But for those of you who do, one of the things I do grasp from math is it's one thing just to look at the answer, and it's another thing to understand how they got there. There are two young high school students who got very famous not too long ago for finding a new proof to the Pythagorean theorem. And the reason why it was so impressive is not because they didn't know the answer. Everybody knew the answer. But they ended up getting national recognition because they found a completely different way of getting there. It was through trigonometry, something I still don't understand. But it was impressive enough that the mathematicians made a big deal about it. And that's the same thing we're seeing here with Solomon. Even if he's giving us an answer we've heard all the way back to the book of Genesis, we're missing an awful lot if we miss the way that he gets there. Because this is in the wisdom literature for a reason. And if you notice how the wisdom literature starts, it starts out with Job, a very successful man trying to piece his life back together again. Going on to David, talking about all the great times he had in life? No. He's talking about the cave moments. Moments we kind of entitled Homeless King. How are you going to basically negotiate life when, all the potential and a lot of what he's talking about is like what we said. We called it the sauce. And it's through all of the things that he's been through. It's not just the good because he was the king. He was essentially the king and the Supreme Court all in one. As much as you think he would be able to make justice perfect. But a lot of what he's talking about in Proverbs is the misery of not being able to do that. And that's one of the consistent themes between Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. No matter how much he's capable of doing, he still laments all that he's still lacking because he cares about the people and there's certain things he still just can't do. What do you think that does for his battle with where he's at right now? Maybe turn with me to chapter 6. Turn back with me to chapter 6 and see how that affected his struggle as a king who cared. where he says, surely oppression drives the wise into madness, flat out. Like we said, going from bad to worse. It's one thing if you don't necessarily see God moving in ways that you understand. It's another thing if you look back on your accomplishments and you realize, but it's another thing if you look at all that you have left to do, and that's simply one more problem left on the table. And so now, whether or not it's his heart for people and all that he sees, no matter how much I've built, no matter how wealthy the entire kingdom has become, there are certain types of leaders who still care enough about those who are missing out amongst all that seems to be going well. And it weighs heavily on Solomon, that it seems to be there's some things that are outside of his control to do, that are things that just should be done. Just apply it to your own life. I think one of the reasons why we get frustrated in life, or if you're anything like me, I'll just speak from a personal perspective, is understanding that no matter how much I get done, there's still this stack somewhere in my life of things that I have not been able to accomplish. And you think that stack makes me feel better, any better when I'm going through these moments? No, that stack just reminds me of no matter how much has been done, no matter how much God has blessed me, no matter how many heights he might have carried me to, there's still some stuff I'm failing at. Some stuff that other people, I look over in the next lane, I'm like, man, they got that under control, bud. And here I am. Same old stack I had a year ago. Where am I? That's what Solomon's dealing with. And so understand, before he gets to that conclusion, though, he's going to give us some hope. And it's going to come not in any great conclusion. It's going to be kind of a blip on the radar. This just kind of grows into some reasons to keep going on. As we turn to chapter 2. Chapter 2, he's going to give us an indication of that very same phrase that we see ending up the book of Ecclesiastes in verse 24. This concept of there's nothing better in life is going to come up at least 3 times, and this is one of them, starting in chapter 2 as he begins to turn the corner. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. This also I saw, this also I saw is from the hand of God. And apart from him, who can eat or what, let me slow down. For apart from him, who can eat or who can have enjoyment? Understanding. He's going to go on to say in verse 26, for to the one who pleases him, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy. And that is the opening of the answer that is going to carry through to that conclusion. Ultimately, what you're going to see in these Ecclesiastes, God willing, as we spend at least a week or two on them, is these contrasts, what we'll call paradoxes. A paradox being something that appears to be a contradiction on the outset. He's going to start railing against toil. He starts out in chapter 2 talking about basically life looked like an amusement park for him. He had enough that he could basically make the world whatever he wanted it to be. And he used it like an amusement park. And that still left him feeling empty. He's going to go from that to talk about how he went to try to feel wise because that was easy for him. I mean, God made it easy for him after the prayer, right? But the wisdom still left him feeling empty. And he's going, wait a minute. I can at least be selfless and do for others, right? But we already talked about where that gets him by the time you get to chapter 6. And so all the work that he's doing before he gets to this part where he's talking about God gives you the ability to enjoy your toil. He talks about how all your work can feel pointless if God is not the one adding joy to it. He's going to go on. He's going to say it's not just work. He's going to say there are going to be some material blessings. There can be some material blessings. I need to steal from notes this week, y'all. If you turn with me to chapter 3. Chapter 3. He's actually going to go on this point about work. Once again, he's going to talk about there being nothing better. I perceive that there is nothing better for them, verse 12 of chapter 3, than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat, drink, and take pleasure in his toil. This is God's gift to man. This is going to go on in verse 22. Verse 22 to say, so I saw that there is nothing better than that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? Well, which is it, Solomon? Is it there's no point in working because it's just miserable, or do you take joy in it? And ultimately the question is simply the place he ends up. It depends upon where you're at with God, bud. And here's the even more complicated picture. He even allows us, when we're doing our best, to still be miserable in our work from time to time, which is one of the reasons why Paul, I believe, says, run with endurance. Because if it was a one-for-one trade, every time I did good, God threw me a treat, I'd be no better than Fido, right? And I'd respond quite that simply. God would have me on a string like he has a mannequin, but he's given me this thing called free will. And one of the things he's testing is how long I'm willing to endure under the strain if all I have is a promise that at some point it will pay off. That's the thing that separates us as what we would call believers from the rest of the world. Why? Because he could have this church full. He could have every church in every block full every week if all he was doing was throwing out treats in response for good behavior. But he's testing character, and he's transforming character into something that he can trust, ultimately, with prizes, like we said before, that he can hand out without having to look over our shoulder as to how we're going to use them. So he'll continue on this, he'll continue on this, he'll continue on in chapter 5, verses 19 and 20. He's then going to talk about accomplishments, and how this is mystery. Okay, I see one person, like he said, with work. Two people are probably doing the same work. One's miserable. The other's happy. Who can figure it out? I don't know. Same thing with wealth, though. Wealth is not just it's not a bad thing, a thing to be beaten up on. Why? Because Solomon's the one writing, and he's going to say in chapter 5, verse 19, in addition to talking about all those who have found the ability to find joy in their work, he's going to say, everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and the power to enjoy them and to accept his life and rejoice in his toil. This is the gift of God. For he will not much remember the days of his life because God keeps him occupied with joy in his heart. Take me there. I'm getting to an age where I'm starting to forget a whole lot. But one of the beautiful things I've seen in life is the way that God does not make my joy dependent upon my memory. And I've gotten to see that over time, the way in which God can so occupy me with joy. And sometimes people ask me about jobs 20 years ago. I'm like, and so with that, there is the memory that there were some good times on those jobs, and there were some bad times on those jobs. But ultimately, to the degree that God is the one in control of how I remember that experience, God willing, to the best of my ability, I did all that I could in the time that I had, so that when he calls it to remembrance, I don't have to remember when I started. I don't have to remember everything that went on every day. All I can remember is, yeah, you mentioned I worked there. I do remember that. I kind of had a good time there. And that kind of good time might be forgetting all of the trouble that went on while I was there. That's the value of a joy that comes from God. It's not denial. It's not pretending like there weren't difficult times there. It's him now giving me a preview of the way I might feel in heaven, in a place where he said he's going to what? Wipe every tear and dry every eye. And so I don't have to remember it perfectly to find joy in the experience after the fact. Praise God for the times where no matter what we remember, he's left us with joy in the place of memory. And my memory is being crowded out by the joy that God has given us. And so he'll go on, make a quick turn in chapter 6 to talk about the very same thing from a different perspective. There is an evil that I have seen under the sun, and it lies heavy on mankind, a man to whom God gives wealth and possessions and honor, so that he lacks nothing of all that he desires. Yet God does not give him power to enjoy them. Same thing, different perspective. And that's the mystery of what God is doing. That's where he ends up. Just before he comes to this conclusion, at least in the first set of verses, he's going to say, skip forward with me, please. Skip forward with me. I'm going to take it out of order. In chapter 8, the last chapter for next week's reading, he's going to make a simple conclusion, going back to his wisdom and the futility in it. When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, how neither day nor night do one's eyes see sleep, then I saw all the work of God, that man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know it, he cannot find it out. And so it's one of those mysteries. If I could give you a simple answer to restoring the hope of individuals who seem like they have lost it, my book would be out right now, guaranteed. And I'd be trying to ask for time off so I could go do my book signings. But I haven't figured that out. And here's the mystery. He's basically saying, Marcus, don't feel bad, because I haven't either. And I am published. And so it's the same thing. He's saying, make sure we set our hopes in the right place, because no matter who you find who is published, one of the mysteries of life is happiness and joy. And as preachers, we try to preach it into you as much as we can, because it's one of the recurring issues of life. But it's one of those things that God has left for his personal relationship with you, which is why that psychiatrist told us, or psychologist told us, make sure you know you run in your lane. Don't try to do too much when you're offering someone a bit of hope. Just try to get them, as our brother talks about, to the hospital. Just stop the bleeding so that they can get to an expert. Because some of these problems are even beyond the experts. And the expert might be able to take a situation you are being able to get overnight. You can get them overnight. They might be able to get them a week. One of the most, I won't say too much, one of the lasting stories that he told us was the most suicidal prone, I think he said it was a 7-year-old, I want to misquote him, that he had seen. And he said it was an individual who by the time he was 7 years old had lived through so much that he was already suicidal. And so he was able to get that young man some time. But by the time he was 15, that young man made good on his attempts to commit suicide. And that was one of the reasons why that expert spoke to me, because he wasn't speaking as an authority as much as he was speaking as someone who simply cares and to help us understand that there are different levels of hope. And what we're seeing in Ecclesiastes is in Solomon, a man who is working through, okay, let me just get through this moment, to maybe let me just get through this day, to maybe just let me get through this week. Okay, wait, this is a cycle that, is there a forever? And that is why that whole refrain of fear God and keep his commandments, even though it sounds super redundant, what he is going to do is take you through all the ways in which that one simple command helped him to find the potential of joy in his work, helped him to regain the potential for joy in his wealth, and then once again helped him appreciate some other things. It's not just always work and wealth and wisdom that we need to worry about. Sometimes it's just, God, thank you for getting me out of some things he talked about at length in the Proverbs, the snares. Chapter 7, beginning around verse 25 and 26. Where he says, I turned my heart to know and to search out and to seek wisdom, and the scheme of his hands are fetters. He who pleases God escapes her, but the sinner is taken by her. Sometimes it's just thank you, God, for giving me the power to get out of traps. That's just one trap that he mentions. But if you recall in the Proverbs, he talked about all kinds of snares, which is much like him listening to his father, David. Once again, if this is Solomon, who much of what he talked about in his time in the cave was how there were so many snares outside of the cave. And so no matter how rocky that bed was, it was better than all the snares and traps that were set for him out in the world. And ultimately, Solomon is getting to borrow from his father David, not having to go through all of those snares and traps, to simply be able to restore his hope by saying, wait a minute, God, I don't get here if you haven't delivered me from all of those snares and traps that are set even for the king of Israel. And rest assured, if even the king of Israel has to worry about snares and traps, to the point where if he's going to restore his hope and his faith enough to move forward, that's one of the things that we need to go back and thank God for too. I might be really upset about where I am right now, but I don't get here if the God who I'm doubting hadn't delivered me through some disgusting trials to get to this point. And so if I'm going to begin to restore my faith or my hope in God, I have to get beyond the moment where I'm fixated on where he has me right now and why this is a complete head scratcher, no matter how much wisdom he's given me and how much emptiness I find in all that wisdom, to just open up once again and do what we call reframe the issue. Satan, the enemy, loves to frame the issue around the problem, enough to make, once again, our situations seem hopeless. But part of getting that next moment or that next day or getting to a place where God can give you a more prolonged sense of peace is reframing the issue beyond that which your enemy is trying to define for you. And that's one of the keys to just starting to find the energy to put one foot back on the floor the next day. Don't let the enemy define life for you. Please just realize that if you can overcome the temptation to let him keep you settled in a place of disappointment and misery, all he's really doing is keeping you away from one of the things, just like my brother said, studying every day. Maybe this week. If there's one takeaway, look up the word refuge. I didn't spend a whole lot of time on it because I don't like to sound redundant. Before I got here, I preached on refuge so much there was another one of my dead horse issues. And so sometimes what happens is you overcompensate. You preach something so much in other places, you don't preach it at all in another. But maybe start this week by looking up that word refuge and how much it comes up in the Psalms. Sometimes if you have one of those Bible programs or softwares that show you how much it appears in each book of the Bible, sometimes you just seeing how much it appears in a certain place can help you understand who's talking about it. It's like football, down and distance, what situation in life they're in, and why, if they're digging themselves out of this pit, this word is coming up over and over again. It's because in the Psalms, no matter how many times it comes up, it's coming up in a period of David's life where the promise is fading in the face of that rocky bed. I'm assuming it was a rocky bed in that cave, right? Or that rainy place he was probably having to sleep out in the field when the cave wasn't suitable. So on and so forth. It's being able to reframe the issue beyond your situation that can allow you to not only provide yourself a modicum of hope or a portion of hope, but for you to once again appreciate something that's easy to lose out on when we're going through difficult times. Sometimes God allows me to go through these things to help someone else. And that sounds really cheesy, except for the fact that that's one of the things that Mom had to encourage me with during one of my lows in life. She said, Marcus, if I had not had to go through this thing on my job before she retired, I'm not sure I could have appreciated as much this thing that you were going through right now. That's a personal story that talks about these difficult times. Sometimes they don't make sense because it wasn't for you. We say it from time to time. It was for you to help save someone you love. Going on. He'll say in Ecclesiastes 8. Verse 2 and 3 is going to say, I say, keep the king's command because of God's oath to him. Because of God's oath to him. Be not hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand in an evil cause, for he does whatever he pleases. All of that aside, understand, we've talked from time to time about the way in which, no matter what our title is, we all have some responsibility and authority. And what he's saying is there are times in life where our responsibility is to hold up under authority that, as Peter's going to say in the New Testament, there's nothing admirable if you're doing well when everything's going right. Who applauds that? Thank you. And so Peter, much like Solomon, it seems, is helping us to understand that the true value comes in standing strong in situations where it ain't right. Because not everybody's willing to do that. Everybody's willing to respond to evil with evil. Is it possible, as we've talked about before, for us to find a way to let God use us to go beyond our wisdom and beyond the times when we are literally, legitimately aggrieved because something wrong is going on, to find out whether or not God can use us to, once again, we say it, make peace. But once again, it has to go beyond my vision. Because my vision ain't so great all the time, especially when I'm in one of these low moments. But he's going to go on to say, once again, so going back to that theme, endurance. Endurance in that very same chapter is going to be one of the things he encourages you with if you find yourself in situations where it does not seem right. But it's even worse for you to respond in an inappropriate way to inappropriate conduct. In Ecclesiastes 8, verses 12 through 13, he's going to say, though a sinner does evil 100 times and prolongs his life, yet I know that it will be well with those who fear God, because they fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked. Neither will he prolong his days like a shadow, because he does not fear before God. Man, I really wish that was that seems like it's the answer, doesn't it? Until you realize a couple of chapters before that, Solomon's going to say, see if I can find it. I didn't highlight it to read this morning. Back up to chapter 7 for me, at verse 15. Where once again, he's going through the roller coaster of thought. Every time he seems like he's got a little bit of hope, 2 steps back. Verse 15, chapter 7. In my vain life, I have seen everything. There is a righteous man who perishes in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man who prolongs his life in his evil doing. Would you pick one, please? I think he's absolutely right about both. And that's one of the reasons why this life is a mystery to even the wisest man on the planet. It's we don't know how God is using righteousness and wickedness to accomplish his purpose. He says, just endure and don't feel tempted to buy into wickedness being the way out, because you got to go back to chapter 8. Because he says, one thing I have seen as a king, is you definitely want to stay out of wicked. Yeah. And the thing that can keep us out of the hopelessness of seeing wickedness win is, once again, Paul writes about it, endurance. And so if there's nothing else that you take away, refuge talked about. Maybe look up refuge, right? Look up refuge this week and see where it appears. But also understand that the key to restoring hope is often in endurance, because the promises are here. And like we said, they seem super cheesy until you realize all the ways in which, going back over it, fearing God and keeping his commandments is the thing that gives you that first glimmer of hope that, wait, my work may have value. That first glimmer of hope that maybe my wisdom is not in vain. Maybe all the material blessings that God has given me, they're not pointless, and so on and so forth. And maybe all the misery I'm in right now is because, like we said, I only have it right now because fearing God and keeping his commandments helped save me from a bunch of snares that should have took me under. Understanding that as he'll conclude, not in the total conclusion, but as we left it out before. I was going to say in chapter 8, verse 17, once again, then I saw all the work of God that man cannot find out, the work that is done under the sun. However much man may toil in seeking, he will not find it out. Even though a wise man claims to know, he cannot find it out. And I think one of the clues he gives us as he works toward that final famous conclusion is ultimately what is really the whole duty of man? Is it really fear God and keep his commandments? Well, what does that look like? Maybe verse 23 of chapter 7 can help us understand, where he'll say, all this I have tested by wisdom. I said, I will be wise, but it was far from me. That which is far off and very deep, far up and deep, very deep, who can find it out? That's another principle going back to the verse we just read. But back up to verse 20 for me. I read the wrong verse. I apologize. Surely there is not a righteous man on the earth who does good and never sins. That's the great equalizer. The thing that once again we said sometimes keeps me from wanting to be this honest is I want to appear like I've got it all together. But if I can, once again, he doubles back to that for a reason. Because one of the ways in which he opens us up to receive new knowledge is basically having us let go of the conceptions we have of life already. I heard it illustrated this way. I can't remember which one. I want to give credit to the more updated version of the Karate Kid, but I don't think it was that one. But this is an illustration I saw once. I used to use it. Once again, one of those things I say, I preach that too much, so just leave it alone. But it was an old master, old wise man, who had a young wise man coming to him at a very crucial time, one of those Save the Earth movies. And as you're asking me for information and for wisdom, but I can't pour anything into a cup that's already full. And so in order to get this young man's attention about some of the things he was going to tell him that were essential to this man solving his problem, but might have seemed goofy, he was going to need this young man not just to pour a little bit out of his cup, but to empty his cup and receive every piece of truth that was actually going to benefit his life and help him get done what he needed to get done. And there are so many times in life where I'm still carrying residual pieces of what I think I know, that I can't get the full answer that God is giving me to offer hope not only to me, but to my loved ones, and God willing, people I've never even met yet, that if I just let him use me, can help me get people just to another moment that God willing will turn into another day that will actually get them to the hands of somebody who can give them maybe another few years, before they fully realize that the only person who can really restore their understanding of why they are here and what they are here to do and whether or not they can find joy in that is the one who made them. And so even though sometimes it sounds redundant, it's like that math problem. Sometimes we've heard the answer over and over again, but there's a reason why God chose to include this book into the Word. It's because you need to understand why or how he got to this answer this way from this starting point. Because he's not starting at the same place his daddy did in the Psalms. He's not starting at the same place that Job did, even though they're all struggling with the same depression and the same downturn in life. There is a different way that God got Solomon out of this pit, because the Solomon of Ecclesiastes ain't even the same Solomon of Proverbs. And so that's another thing to understand. Once again, God might have gotten you through a whole lot, but unless you understand how he got to the answer this time, you may have your cup too full to receive the relief and the hope that he has for us all. As we together stand and sing.
When we walk with the Lord.